how many, and you might not be aware of this, but as opposed to listen to, because that implies choice, how many have heard a radio station? For example, if you rode to school with a friend or parents or something, and the radio is on in the car, you might not have chosen it. I don't like country music, or whatever it is, or I don't want to hear, news talk in the morning. But you're still exposed to it. That counts in this number, and the reason it does is because advertisers can make an impression on you whether you choose to hear that or not. And the name of the game is money.
Money.
It has to be, because it's a free enterprise system, because they don't exist if you can't make money. I mean, we like to be altruistic and just put things on for people's benefit, but you have to monetize it or you're out of business. And if you're out of business, it doesn't exist, and so nobody hears anything. So you have to be able to monetize it and generate some revenue. So that's why hearing is different than listening, because listening implies that you're actually choosing or paying attention, where a lot of people aren't. You just hear it on. So if you think about it that way, you think on a weekly basis, well, yeah, I was probably exposed to it, even though I didn't choose it. A lot of people feel that once you think about it. But generally, you're not aware of it. So, but it permeates everything. It's ubiquitous. It's just everywhere.
But
you walk into a store.
I do think that that's changing, because in my own household, my daughter uses her cell phone as a navigation tool, and instead of listening to the radio, she chooses her streaming music service.
Yeah.
Which is not really it's not in the
That is not in there, and you're absolutely right, it is changing. It used to be a lot higher than that. I mean, this is the worst it's ever been. It's still 93%. So the point being is that everybody thinks it's the oldest electronic medium, that it's antiquated and old and nobody uses it and it's out of favor. Well, it's out of favor compared to 10 years ago, but not by too much.
Jeremiah, you were going to say something?
Oh, I never listen to radio in my car. I always use Bluetooth streaming.
Right, exactly. And what do you stream? Do you stream a music service like Spotify or something like that? Or do you ever listen? For example, there's a lot of different apps you can get where you can actually hear radio stations too. A lot of people do that.
Music.
Well, that counts, because you're hearing the station. Instead of coming over a receiver, it's coming over and through the internet and into your receiver, which is just smaller, or maybe in your car. Because a lot of times the apps are just right in your car now.
But
They're
does
built in most
Spotify
cars.
have commercials?
Yes, if you don't pay for it.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the bottom one is podcasts. Podcasts are becoming huge. All you need is a computer and a microphone, and everybody can have a voice, right? And if you just randomly go and listen to podcasts like on Apple Podcast or Shoutcast or any of the big services out there, have you heard some of the stuff that's out there? It's abysmal. I mean, most of it is really bad. Some of it is really, really compelling and really good. The #1 podcast in America is by a guy named Joe Rogan. I don't recommend it because he's pretty rough around the edges, but he is compelling. He's a great interviewer, but he breaks all the rules, or most of the rules. For one thing, brevity is key. People can grasp and listen to things in short pieces easier than they can listen to long form stuff. Well, his podcasts run between 2 and 3 hours. So that's a huge rule breaker, but he's #1 in America. Actually, I think he's #1 in the world. So what that tells us is content is king. He puts on amazingly interesting guests, and he is so curious that he's a great interviewer. I mean, he's asking the kind of questions of people that we would want to ask. And that's a great interviewer, when you're curious enough to want to know. And he's not afraid to ask the questions that are not polite, right? Like a lot of interviewers are. Because he realizes that this is not the forum to be polite. This is the forum to find out compelling information from people, because there's a fascinating world out there. He knows it, and he wants to bring it to people. So think about this, right? We talked about the different things. Radio is like the vehicle. That's just a platform, it's a method, it's a vehicle, it's a way to get out there. And there's a lot of them. And I use radio in that loose of a term. the person who's on there, and I put announcer, but I mean whoever is announcing, talking, conveying, communicating is the driver. Well, the driver, it doesn't matter if you're getting from point A to point B on a horse, in a Maserati, on a ship. You're moving from point A to point B, and the vehicle is really secondary to you getting from, if it's important to get from point A to point B, how you get there is not as important as actually getting there. So to convey a message, you can use a lot of different vehicles to be able to get that message out and communicate. If you remember last time I said, good communicators are almost always successful. And poor communicators almost always aren't. Well, think about somebody who's working in say that you're a researcher, or let's say that you're working in a lab, okay? You're a scientist and you're inventing stuff in a lab. Are those people communicating in the traditional sense that much? No, they're typically buried, they're kind of geeky, they're wearing their smock, you know, they're doing their stuff on the counter or on the board, and they're working away, they're doing whatever they can do, and they're not talking much. But do they communicate?
Yes.
How so? How do they do that? You can communicate by not only talking, but you can communicate. What's another way to communicate? A way. Go ahead.
Eye contact. Eye contact.
Yeah, okay, podcast. Somebody just said writing, right? You can write, you can talk. Is singing communication? You bet. What about acting? Of course. What about poetry? Oh, it's writing. You see what I mean? There's lots of different ways to do it. What about conveying an idea, like I just discovered the cure for cancer here, and before I go to the New England Journal of Medicine or try to get it published, am I going to let other people in on it? How am I going to communicate what I just discovered or what I found out to other people, to other scientists? I'm going to show them. So showing is communicating. And so bear that in mind. That's what I'm talking about. It doesn't necessarily have to be in front of a microphone or a camera, although that is a way to communicate, right? So the difference of the two, the vehicle is different than the person who actually does the communicating, all right? So if you're trying to learn to communicate, don't worry. It's very scary. Right now we don't have studios built, but we will soon. We won't probably before the end of the, well, in fact, I know we won't before the end of the school year, but next year, for those of you who are not seniors and you want to be here and you want to get in front of a camera or in front of a microphone, we're going to have actual studios dedicated just to that. Well, that terrifies most people, but don't worry, with a little bit of practice and with a little bit of discipline, and if you keep working on it, you can really, really improve. You're going to feel like that up there and you go, man, I don't know how to do this. Or if I did once, I'm rusty now. I haven't done it for a long time, since 6th grade when we did our play or whatever. But then you can really, really turn into the kicking Maserati. That's right, you recognize that. And it is not that hard to do, but you have to get over the fear factor, and I can help you do that. So here it is again. You heard me say it before, you heard me say it last week, this week, you'll hear it all the time. Usually good communicators are successful. They're on the mountaintop, they win, right? Poor communicators typically are not successful. And that's a big reason they're not successful, because they don't convey, they don't influence anybody. And it's all about influence, okay? So this is a kind of a long quote, but I'm going to read it to you because it's important. The person who can capture and hold attention is the person who can effectively influence human behavior. And that's what this is all about. You want to influence human behavior. What we may ask is a failure? What is a failure? Well, a person without influence is a failure. Because they're isolated, right? One to whom nobody attends. The inventor, who can persuade no one of the value of his device. The merchant, who can attract not enough people into his store. The teacher, whose pupils don't pay any attention while he tries to capture their attention. But the poet who writes reams of verse that no one will accept. That's a great quote, because what it does is it puts it into it, that's why it's highlighted, influencing human behavior. And that's huge. You want to do that because, man, the movers and shakers are the people who can influence other people. Anybody know who this guy is? He was called the Great Communicator. He went on to become President of the United States. You can't do it. I gave you the answer last time. How about somebody else? You have any idea? He is somebody talking, you know it also from last year. He's on WHO in Des Moines, Iowa, radio station. And he went on to become the Great Communicator.
Is it Ronald Reagan?
You are correct. Now do you recognize him?
Ronald Reagan.
There he is. The guy was so, the press hated him, by the way. They called him stodgy old guy who slept through all of his cabinet meetings, and I mean, he was not a lefty, and the press is very left, and so they didn't like him. He was conservative, and so conservatives are evil and terrible and all that. So they hated Reagan. But despite that, he was reelected and took 49 states except for the state of Minnesota, because his opponent, Walter Mondale, was from Minnesota. And so it's the only state that went Mondale. Everybody else, all 49, if you can imagine, went
That's
Reagan.
just
That's a guy who
unheard of
can
in a day like
communicate.
today. Yeah.
Isn't that amazing? Really is. So in mastering communication, it's learning how to read, how to write, how to breathe, how to speak, how to project, because those are all things that you do to influence people, right? The most important thing is, that's all secondary, you have to have something worth saying, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that are actually, that you're passionate about, or you care about, or you would like to see, or gee,